What is happening in flight? We will now look at what happens to a projectile in flight once it has left the barrel. There are a number of influences that will affect a projectile, such as weight or shape of a projectile, but the biggest one is MET. What is MET? MET is short for Meteorological Office. If you have watched the TV or listened to the radio, you would have come across this. Meteorological, or MET, is a weather forecast. The Met Office predicts the weather across the UK. It is possible that the weather can influence a projectile in flight over a long distance, like it would do on an aircraft. We also must take into consideration that the weather will not be the same as where we fire the gun to where the target is. We will now look at some effects the weather has on a projectile in flight. Temperature. An increase of temperature will reduce the density of the air. With a reduction in the air density, this will reduce the drag on a projectile. The outcome on the projectile will be an increase in range. The opposite effect will happen if the temperature is low. Humidity. As a projectile travels through the rain droplets cause friction. This friction will slightly reduce the speed at which a projectile is travelling at. The outcome on a projectile will be a decrease in range. Wind. The wind poses two threats to a projectile. First is a head or tailwind. If a projectile is travelling in a tailwind, this would greatly reduce the drag of a projectile, which would increase the range. The opposite effect would happen in a headwind. The second threat is a crosswind, which will push a projectile left or right of the target. Gridded MET. For a first round accuracy on the target, we need to mitigate against these effects. Gridded MET is a system that predicts the weather from where you fire from to the intended target, taking into consideration the weather in between. Imagine having a system that could predict the weather every 100-metre grid so that you can bypass the bad weather walking back from school. Gridded MET does this, but instead of every 100-metre grids, it can be 12 to 15 kilometre grids. With this system in place, we can increase or decrease the range of a projectile or fire left or right to offset the weather.